Welcome, gamers! Ugh, still feel dirty saying that. Anyway, welcome back to another Lessons with Luismenverg. We got a long one today because there's a lot of ground to cover. So, video games, right? Everybody loves them. But to play a video game, you need something to play a video game on. After all, without it, it's just a game or a disc. And discs aren't fun. I mean, maybe you could play Frisbee with them, but whatever. Point is, you need a console to play a game. And throughout the year, there have been many consoles released. And that's what this video is about. The consoles that you put the disc or cartridge in, and then you play games. Got it? Good. Now, games have existed since the 1950s when people were turning old radars into games. But we're not talking about the history of video games in general, we're talking about the consoles. So things like PCs and arcades will not be mentioned. Got it? Good. Also, we'll only be talking about the really notable consoles, so all the Pong consoles or consoles nobody really talks about today will not be included. Anyways, let's start off with a discussion on the very first video game console, the Magnavox Odyssey. Released in 1972, one look at this thing and, yeah, you could tell this was the first. The only graphics are two white sticks and a small white square. Didn't have any other graphics, didn't have sound effects, and it didn't even have any way to enforce rules or keep track of scores. So yes, its games literally relied on an honor system. Another thing to note is that every game was two-player only, so you had to have somebody play with you if you wanted to experience it. So, what were the games like? First off, the console itself came with a decent chunk of its library, so that's a plus. Also, it didn't have a power button. The console would just turn on when you put a game in. And these weren't like the cartridges of today where they contain games, rather, these are more like switches that told the two sprites how to act. And since it didn't have graphics besides the playable pixels, the console instead came with overlays that you would put on the TV to basically fill in the blanks of what you were doing. It also came with a light gun, which just straight up looked like a rifle. You see, toy guns used to look basically identical to real guns, but then there were some incidences where kids got shot because police mistook their toy guns for real guns. It led to laws making it so that all toy guns had to have a distinction of some sorts, like being brightly colored. That's a bonus fact for you. Overall, very primitive, but like, what do you expect? It's the first. That's like criticizing the first animals for not being able to be on land. Anyway, the Odyssey wasn't really popular, mostly because people thought it would only work on Magnavox TVs. It did sell over 300,000 units, which is nothing to sneeze at for the video game granddaddy. Okay, now that we got the first out of the way, let's go on a company by company basis. First off, let's go a few years later to talk about the consoles of the late 70s and early 80s. Atari is one of the most popular games in retro gaming, as they're the ones who made console gaming popular, and it was all thanks to this, the Atari 2600. This console revolutionized the home gaming scene, since between the Odyssey and this, all that really came out were consoles that only played Pong. Lame. This is the console that revolutionized cartridges that you could swap out to switch games, and unlike the Odyssey, these were actual games and not just sticks that you had to use your imagination to enjoy. The 2600 had a very simple controller. All it had was a joystick to move and a single red button to perform an action. Most Atari games didn't have any sort of goal. Just like arcade games, they were just about getting the high score. Atari didn't have that many original games. Most of its catalog was just arcade ports, and its graphics were very simple. Most of the colorful arcade games ended up getting ports that looked like, well, a lot less colorful. Most of the big names of the arcade got releases on the Atari, including Donkey Kong and Mario Brothers, which is just weird to think about, seeing Nintendo characters on a non-Nintendo console, and officially no less. Anyways, Atari was the king of this generation of games, but when you're on top, people want you to get to the bottom, and that's where we find their competitors. In this corner, we have the ColecoVision, and in the other corner, the Intellivision, its two greatest competitors. Now, despite the similar names and the fact that the consoles look basically identical, they weren't related. ColecoVision was made by now-defunct computer company Coleco, and the Intellivision was made by famous toy company Mattel. Yeah. First thing you might notice about these consoles is their controllers. Yes, their controllers had keypads. And yes, each button does something different. and not every game uses every button, so good luck figuring out the controls. These games had better graphics than the 2600, but the confusing control scheme really turned a lot of people away, making this the first time in gaming when people realized that graphics really can't save a game. Unfortunately, people would eventually forget this lesson. And actually, I don't think they ever relearned it, considering that to this day, people are like, oh, graphics are the most important, blah, 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 blah. The Intellivision is notable for the fact that it had all sorts of add-ons to it, like there was one that added voices to game, and another that let you play Atari games on the console. Yes, this was an accessory that let you play the games of the console's competitor. These consoles weren't exactly failures, as combined they both sold 5 million units, which is respectable, but nothing compared to Atari, and both did not last long compared to the juggernaut of the 2600. Okay, back to Atari. It was still reigning supreme, but something happened. You see, at first only Atari was allowed to make games for the system, but some people started making games behind their back, and they were not happy about this. So they took him to court. But then the judge ruled that anybody could make games for Atari and sell them in stores. So now, Atari weren't the only ones making games, and anybody with programming knowledge could release games for the Atari. I'm sure this won't have any negative consequences. No, sir. In 1982, things took a turn for the worst. Atari released the 5200, their next system. This guy was massive, and it had slots for 4 controllers. Anyways, gone were the simple pick up and play controllers of the 2600. This guy clearly learned a lesson from its competitors and decided to have a keypad. Yay. Also, it had a pause button, which, believe it or not, was a revolutionary feature for the time. So the next gen Atari is out. People are going to eat it up, right? Right? No. The 5200 was a failure, mostly because people weren't really given a reason why they should buy it. You see, most of the 5200's catalogs was just 2600 games, just with better graphics. So why would people buy a system just to have to buy the same games all over again? Plus, it was not backwards compatible with the 2600, which confused people since the Intellivision could play 2600 games. So why couldn't the 2600's big brother? And the controllers were very criticized. So the system was a flop, only selling 1 million units, and it was discontinued in just 2 years. Oh, but things are only gonna get worse. Not just for Atari, but for the entire video game scene. 1982 was a rough year for video games, and it was all thanks to some very bad things to happen to Atari. Remember how I said anybody could make and release games for this system? Well, guess what? It did have consequences. Because there were no restrictions, it led to things like a flood of cheap shovelware games that only existed to sell other products. Even dog food companies made games for the Atari. And even worse, there were some NSFW games for the system, which angered parents as these games were literally just naked people doing things that I guess were supposed to be seen as attractive. Not sure who finds Atari graphics attractive, but hey, I guess there's something for everyone, I guess. Also, people started realizing that all these video game consoles had basically the exact same libraries. So people were like, wait, so should I get an Atari or ColecoVision? All these issues were piling up. Let's just hope Atari doesn't botch 2 hyped games. And they did just that. Pac-Man was one of the most popular games of the 80s, but for a variety of reasons, it took a while for it to come to home consoles. And when it finally landed on the 2600, well, this is the arcade version. This is the 2600 version. Need I say more? This version had very annoying sound effects, the ghost sprites would flicker out of existence, the colors were disgusting, and it just screamed rush job. Now, this game was successful. It became the highest selling game for the console, but people did not enjoy it. It was seen as a major step down from the beloved arcade game. And then Atari released E.T. The film was making bank at the box office, so Atari decided to make a licensed game to ride the hype. And because they wanted to cash in on the hype, they only gave themselves a few weeks to make the game. This gifted us E.T. on the Atari 2600. To this day, often pointed to as the prime example of terrible licensed games. This game involved E.T. looking for pieces to phone home, but to find the pieces, you had to fall into pits. Yes, really. This was a game all about falling into holes. Like Pac-Man, this game sold well, but people hated it. And as a result of Atari completely botching two hyped games, the straw officially broke the camel's back, and boom, the home video game market went south. Nobody was buying consoles anymore. Arcades are still popular, but as for the home, no. I'll talk about the end of the crash later, but for now, let's look at what Atari did after we recovered. In 1986, they released the 7800, which was like an improved version of the 5200, addressing basically all the complaints. It could play 2600 games, and the controller was improved, going back to the 2600 simplicity. Unfortunately, this was too little too late, as the system was a lot more primitive than its competitors, and people just weren't interested in score attack games anymore. So, in 1989, they went handheld with the Atari Lynx. It was in full color and had backlighting, but it failed to outdo its competitors, mostly because it didn't really have any notable games on it. Okay, Atari needs a miracle. They used to rule the world of gaming, but now they are always in dead last. So, as a last desperate move, they released the Jaguar. Released in 1993, this was advertised as a system that would blow its competitors out of the water. Those other wimpy consoles were only 16-bit. The big boy Jaguar, meanwhile, was 64 bits. Yeah, they even made very condescending commercials calling people who didn't buy the Jaguar stupid. Because as we all know, the best way to get people to buy something is to insult them. The Jaguar was a complete failure for a variety of reasons. First off, the controls. Yep, they went back to the keypad. Lovely. Secondly, the graphics. This console was advertised as a 64-bit system that would blow its competitors out of the water with its superior images. But people quickly realized that the games for the Jaguar weren't that much more impressive than its so-called lesser competitors. Many of them were sprite-based, and the few 3D games failed to impress. This is because the Jaguar isn't exactly a 64-bit console. It didn't have a 64-bit processor. Rather, it had two 32-bit processors, which Atari reasoned equaled 64 bits, so yeah. Now, this also made the system a nightmare to program for, and is the reason why so many of the games don't look all that impressive compared to the competition. And this also led to a general lack of games, so people had even less of a reason to buy the console. The system was a flop, only selling about 150,000 units, which at this point in history is just pathetic. They tried to revive it with a CD add-on, but that didn't help, and it often had issues of connecting. So not a good console. Though my dad liked his, so they had one fan. After this, Atari stopped making consoles. They're still around, but they mostly make compilations of 2600 games. So yeah, they basically just resorted to being like, hey guys, remember us? Gen Xers, look, we're here. We're still around. Hey, play these games you like, huh? Huh? Yeah. It's genuinely kind of sad. Imagine being a company that failed so bad that nowadays all you do is try to recapture nostalgia. That's basically what Atari's doing. Well, from a fallen titan to someone who's still going, let's move on to Nintendo's an old company, starting before video games even existed. For a while, they didn't really specialize in anything. They tried out all sorts of things. Sold cards, made taxis, even made electronic toys, and they even made hotels. Eventually, Nintendo made their first consoles, the color TV games, which were Pong consoles. Great start. In 1980, they released the Game & Watch. Now, this wasn't a console in the traditional sense, it was more like a digital toy. You see, there were multiple Game & Watch devices, each one had its own game pre-built. These games were very primitive. They didn't really have movement, rather they were like animation cells. They had a background of all the graphics visible at once, and when you pushed a button, one of the graphics lit up, signifying movement. These games didn't have plots. Just like arcade games, they were just high score things. The Game & Watch is pretty successful, as in total it sold over 40 million units, and they made games through it all throughout the 80s. But then Nintendo made a major breakthrough, not just for themselves, but for all the gaming industry. This is the Famicom, released in Japan in 1983. Short for Family Computer, this console was like the Atari, but it was just better. Better graphics, it had more complex controllers without doing that keypad thing, and it had games on it actually worth playing that weren't just arcade ports. The Famicom was a great success in Japan, and they knew they had to bring it to America. One problem, though. In 1983, the market collapsed and no one was buying consoles anymore. So how could they make this thing succeed? Well, Nintendo got an idea. They completely redesigned the system, doing everything in their power to make sure it wouldn't be seen as a video game system. One of the most important things they did was they called it an entertainment system. The NES. You see, this is basically Nintendo going, oh, no, 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 no. It's not a video game system, it's an entertainment system. Plus, they designed the NES to look more like a VCR than a console, which is why the cartridges went in the side instead of on top like basically every other cartridge console, including the Famicom. And most importantly, they bundled it with Rob, the robotic operating buddy. This was a robot who could play games with you, and he was touted as a must-have for the NES. Though in the end he was only compatible with 2 games, and he's not remembered very fondly due to how slow he was. It also came with a light gun, the NES Zapper, which could be used to play shooting games. Nintendo's little Trojan horse strategy not only worked, but it basically saved the gaming industry. The NES was a must-have console. It ended up selling twice as much as the 2600, and it managed to avoid the problems that killed that system. Oh, Atari was flooded with cheaply made games? Don't worry, Nintendo has a lockout chip in their system that makes it so that a game has to be approved by them in order to play. But of course, people found a way around this, but hey, people will find a way out of any technological restriction. Not safe for work games? Yeah, no. Nintendo was very strict with what content was allowed in their games, so none of that Atari junk. All game consoles have exactly the same libraries. Nintendo had very strict exclusivity clauses, saying that if your game was on the NES, it wasn't allowed on any other console. The NES is where gaming as we know it started today. No more score attack games. Now games are all about goals. Whether it be rescuing somebody or just defeating the bad guy, you could beat an NES game. And some games introduce the concept of saving your progress, meaning you didn't even need to play the game all in one sitting. So yeah, the NES, the savior of gaming. In 1989, Nintendo released the Game Boy, a revolutionary handheld. This was like a real console that you could fit in your hand. Unlike the Game & Watch, where all the games are basically their own console, the Game Boy was just one console that, like a real system, had cartridges to switch games. The Game Boy had black and white graphics, but since the screen was green, that's what all the graphics were seen as. In addition, the Game Boy had no backlight, so you could only see the games in a well-lit environment. Also, in order to play multiplayer, you needed to physically hook up 2 Game Boys together with a cable. But despite these shortcomings, the Game Boy was a huge success and it ended up selling like hotcakes. It sold over 100 million consoles and is the 4th best-selling console of all time. The Game Boy lasted throughout the 90s and it outlived all its competitors, even ones that had actual color and lighting. And this is pinned on the fact that, sure, they may have been fancier, but they were a lot more inconvenient, since they all had terrible battery life. Meanwhile, the Game Boy could last more than a day on just 4 AA's. Also helping the Game Boy sales was the Pokemon boom of the late 90s, and so once that came out, everybody wanted a Game Boy so they could catch them all. So yeah, the Game Boy. Proof that powerful hardware means nothing if your competitor beats you at everything else. When the 90s came along, it was clear to Nintendo they needed an upgrade. After all, their competitors were starting to go to 16-bit, so they needed to keep up with them. And thus, we got the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or Super Famicom in Japan. Released at the start of the 90s, the SNES was basically the NES, but just better. Better graphics, better gameplay, more storage space, allowing for bigger games. Yeah, it was the whole package. Plus, it was a top loader now, so it didn't experience the glitches that could befall NES games due to being a side loader. Now, the SNES didn't sell as much as the NES, but it was still a lot more successful than its competitors, proving Nintendo could once again dominate the 16-bit era. So Nintendo's on top of the gaming world. Their competitors are strong, but they can't touch them. Nothing will stop them, right? Right? But before we get to their next console, we have to make a pit stop with the Virtual Boy. Oh boy. This is advertised as a VR gaming experience you could take anywhere. Unfortunately, this system was a failure. For one, it was a pain to play. It didn't have a strap, so you had to lean in to play it, and it made it hard to bring anywhere. Secondly, the games released for it didn't take advantage of the VR at all. Only 2 games had any sort of FPS perspective, and some had 3D effects, but every other game was just like a Game Boy game. And the worst part? The graphics were red and black. Combine this with the fact that you had to keep it right up to your eyes, and this caused many eye issues. So, system was a flop, and to this day, Nintendo doesn't like to talk about it. They've even made fun of it a few times. The next year, we got the Nintendo 64, Nintendo's big leap to 3D. Games are now polygonal, and you can move along the Z-axis now. Since Nintendo was the lead of the last 2 gaming generations, you might expect this to happen again. Unfortunately, the Nintendo 64 was not a big success, and this is for a few reasons. For one, the 64 did not use CDs like its competitors. Yep, they are still using cartridges. Sure, it cut down on load times, which was a big issue for early CD consoles, but this also meant that the games weren't as advanced as competitors, leading to games often having stripped down versions and brought to the 64. Plus, it was just harder to make games for it than its competitors, as CDs were a lot easier to put games on, and since they could hold more space, developers flocked to the CD users as opposed to lower memory cartridges. This left the Nintendo 64 with not very many third-party games. Nintendo tried to remedy this with the 64DD, which would allow for more space in games and allow DLC, but the device was a flop, and only a few games were released for it, and basically every other game planned for it was developed as a regular N64 game. Also, can I say something? This controller just sucks. Why is the main movement stick in the center of the controller? Who thought this was a good idea? Now, the 64 wasn't a flop or anything, and lots of the games for it are considered classics, but it was clear Nintendo was losing their place at the top. Hopefully next time they'll do better. In 1998, we got the Game Boy Color, a new model for the Game Boy that, as its name suggests, could play Game Boy games in color. Still no backlight, though. In addition to playing Game Boy games in color, it had its own exclusive games, which were designated by having a clear cartridge. These games were in full color completely, as opposed to just adding a splash of color to black and white graphics. No. These games had their own unique palettes and things like that. Overall, decent roadblock, but not anything to write home about. In 2001, Nintendo released the GameCube. This purple square was Nintendo's first foray into disc technology, but unlike everyone else who was using CDs, Nintendo used mini discs. Plus, they fixed the controllers, and now it doesn't feel like they were designed for people with 3 arms, so that's already an improvement. But the GameCube did not help Nintendo get back on top. In fact, Nintendo was in 3rd place this generation, only being ahead of the Sega Dreamcast, which we'll get to later. So why did the GameCube not do too hot? Well, it's for a few reasons. For one, it lacked anything special compared to its competitors. Those guys could go online and play DVDs, but the GameCube, it didn't have any of that. But the bigger reason is that the GameCube was seen as a kid's console. Now, they've been seen as a kids' company for a while now, but this is when their reputation started to hurt. Its competitors were becoming known for their violent M-rated games of blood and swearing and nudity, while Nintendo was now starting to be seen as the company for kids. The PS2 and Xbox are for real gamers. So the GameCube left Nintendo in third place, while its competitors raked in the money. Things are better on the handheld side, though, as the Game Boy Advance launched the same year, and since Nintendo didn't really have any competitors in the handheld market, it did a lot better, though the GBA still didn't have a backlight. But then in 2003, they released the SP, which finally had a backlight, allowing you to finally play games in the dark. Oh yeah. And in 2004, we got the DS. It originally stood for Developer System, but since it has two screens, everyone thought it meant dual screens, and Nintendo was like, you know what? Yeah, that's what it stands for. Anyways, the DS had a touchscreen, which allowed for more ways to interact with games, complete with a stylus pen, which, let's be real, everybody lost. The DS could also play 3D games unlike other previous handheld consoles, and like a cell phone, it had non-game applications, and it was chargeable so you didn't have to buy batteries anymore. The DS was a massive success. It was even more popular than the Game Boy. It is the second highest selling console of all time. So yeah, very nice console. Alright, GameCube was a disappointment. Nintendo needs a miracle, and they need it now. And luckily, unlike Atari, Nintendo bounced back. In 2006, they released the Wii. This slick white console's main gimmick was that it was motion controlled. The controllers were wireless, and you pointed it at the screen, causing a cursor to appear, allowing you to click on things, kind of like a computer mouse. And moving the Wii remote could cause actions within the games themselves. In addition, the Wii featured a lot of non-game applications, like weather news channels, you could browse the internet, and you could even make little avatars of yourself called Miis, which could be used in games. And not only could the Wii play GameCube games, you could even download retro games onto your Wii. So, fancy gadget, and it paid off big time. Nintendo was finally on top again, being the 7th best-selling console of all time and trouncing its competitors. This is often pinned on the fact that the Wii advertised itself as a family console that everyone regardless of age could enjoy. So because of that, many families bought one, allowing people of all ages to play games together. Unfortunately, while commercially successful, its actual reputation was, not so good. Gamers were not happy with the system, as many complained about how the Wii was too casual and lacked the hardcore games you can kill people and cause a ruckus. Plus, unlike its competitors, the Wii wasn't HD, so graphic bros, the people who are always like, yeah, graphics are the most important thing about a game. Yeah, they were always making fun of it. But regardless, Wii was a success and Nintendo was back on top. In 2011, Nintendo continued the success of the DS with the 3DS, main gimmick being its 3D slider that would double the screen's image, making it stereoscopically 3D. Well, let's be real, nobody ever used that feature. The 3DS had a pretty rocky start, mostly because it had a high price and a poor battery life. Eventually, it took off after price slashes and upgraded versions helped increase its battery life. Wasn't as successful as its predecessor, but as we'll soon see, it basically kept Nintendo alive during the 2010s. In 2012, Nintendo followed up the wildly successful Wii with the Wii U, and oh boy was this a disaster. But first, the console itself. The Wii U's main gimmick was that its main controller was a tablet that the games would be broadcasted on, which allowed you to play games while others were using the TV. But unfortunately, it needed to be close to the TV to work, as going far away from the console would sever the connection, so it wasn't exactly portable. The Wii U was a failure, becoming their worst-selling home console. Reason for this is blamed on two things. For one, many people didn't realize that this was a new console and thought it was an add-on for the Wii. Secondly, it had abysmal advertising. You know how Nintendo has a reputation for being the kids' company? Yeah, these commercials did not help. Basically, all commercials for Wii U games featured little kids, and it scared off the more hardcore gaming crowd. Combine this with its poor launch that had barely any games, and the Wii U was a failure, despite having several games that are considered good. So, Nintendo was officially in a dark age. The 3DS was holding them up, but the Wii U was a massive letdown. But, like before, they managed to bounce back. In 2017, they released the Switch, and oh man, what a comeback. The Switch's gimmick is that it is both a home and portable console, which you can switch between, Anyways, the Switch was a major turnaround for Nintendo. It's currently the third best-selling console, and once again, Nintendo is on top. This is thanks to fixing the Wii U's bad marketing campaign by now showing people of all ages playing the games, instead of only showing little kids. And it was unmistakably its own console. So, Nintendo's back on top for now. But who knows what the future will bring. So, that's Nintendo for you. Ups and downs, but I doubt it's going anywhere. Sega. Once Nintendo's biggest competitor is now releasing games for them. How did this happen? Well, let's go back in time and see where it all began. Sega's first console was the SG-1000, which was only released in Japan, so we're not talking about it. Their first notable console is the Master System. This 8-bit system came out in 1985, and then came to America a year later. This system had a weird joystick D-pad hybrid thing and a 1 and 2 button instead of A and B. The Master System's games all had this weird graph paper aesthetic on their covers, and some games could even be played in 3D. Oh yeah. The Master System didn't really take off though, mostly because none of the games for it were considered anything to write home about. It sold 10 million units, which is nothing to sneeze at, but this was far below the juggernaut of a competitor it had with the NES. At least in America and Japan, the Master System was super popular in Brazil, and in fact, they're still making them there to this day. But in the game industry, they really only care about America and Japan, so Sega sought out to make a better console, something that could give Nintendo real competition. And they could do that by making a system more powerful than the NES. This is the Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis in America. And when it dropped in 1989, it gave Nintendo real competition. You see, as the marketing pointed out, the NES was only 8 bits, and the Genesis was 16 bits. In fact, the marketing for the system did everything in their power to convince you that this was far cooler than the NES. Not only did it have better graphics, but they had games featuring celebrities. And of course, there's their classic slogan, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. This is the first time Nintendo had real competition, and the marketing paid off. People started adopting this new system and looked down on those 8-bit losers. Unfortunately, at first the Genesis's game pool was pretty weak. Sure, they had celebrity games, but star power does not make a good video game. They needed a breakthrough hit, and they needed it fast. Especially since it was clear they were getting to Nintendo and they were going to make their own 16-bit console, so they needed something to sell units. And that's where Sonic the Hedgehog comes in. This game got fantastic reviews and everyone who played it loved it for its sense of speed. And this gave Sega a great idea. They started selling Genesis consoles with Sonic 1 included, which boosted sales tremendously. Then, when Sonic 2 came out and was considered even better, they once again made it a pack-in title. Another thing that helped the Genesis is that it was seen as the cool kids console compared to that baby Nintendo system. They had blood and other things too hot for Mario. The best example being Mortal Kombat, which when it came to home consoles was censored because, well, I don't know if you know this, but the first Mortal Kombat was kind of a controversial game. But while the NES version was completely censored, the Genesis version had a code to restore the original violence, making it the far more popular version. So, you got a wildly popular mascot, you have the reputation as the cool kids console, everything seems great. The Genesis sold 30 million units, and while the Super Nintendo ultimately came out on top, it still gave it healthy competition. But unfortunately, the seeds for Sega's downfall were starting to get planted. You see, Sega knew they couldn't keep the Genesis going forever. They needed some way to spice it up, so they added all sorts of crazy add-ons to make it last longer. First, there was the Sega CD, an add-on that could play games on, well, CDs. Unfortunately, most of the games for it were just crappy FMVs, and there were only a few games for it that I consider good. It didn't do so hot, as only a small fraction of Genesis owners had the CD. But an even bigger failure was the 32X. You see, despite the Jaguar being a failure, it did actually scare Sega. After all, 64 is a big number compared to 16, and Sega was worried their next console wouldn't be out in time to compete with it, so they developed the 32X as a way to breathe life into the Genesis in the interim. This was advertised as a way to play 32X games on the Genesis. Unfortunately, their next console was indeed coming out on time, so when the 32X dropped, people wondered what the point of it was since the next console was just a few months away, so they wondered, why should we buy this when we're already saving our money for the next console? And game developers wondered the same thing. Why should we waste money trying to learn how to make games for this hardware when your next hardware is right around the corner? Because of this, the Sega 32X had very few games, and it was a complete failure. Oh, but things are only gonna get worse. But first, let's backpedal a little. As in 1990, Sega made their own version of the Game Boy with the Game Gear. It was in full color and had backlit screen, so take that, Nintendo. Unfortunately, the Game Gear suffered in sales. 10 million units is pretty good, but compared to the phenomenon that was the Game Boy, this looks like chicken scratch. The biggest reason for the, underwhelming sales is the battery life. It took 6 AA batteries and only lasted about 3 hours, compared to the Game Boy, which only took 4 and could last all day. So it was far less convenient, and it kind of tapered off. Okay, back to Sega's failure. Their next console was the Sega Saturn. Released in the mid-90s, this was Sega's foray into next-gen hardware, 32-bit graphics, 3D gameplay. Oh yeah, what could go wrong? Well, a few things. This was the time that PlayStation was coming to town, and when Sega found out it was going to be cheaper than the Saturn, they got scared. So, the Saturn was released well ahead of schedule in the US. How early? Well, basically, they pretty much just sprung it out of nowhere. They just walked on stage one day and was like, Saturn's out right now. Stores were not prepared for this, and because of this, retailers started boycotting the Saturn, cutting off potential buyers. And because it launched early, that meant that people would have to wait a while for actual games to start coming out. Not off to a great start, but things only got worse from there. What sold the Genesis? Sonic the Hedgehog. Don't worry, Sonic will help boost sales figures. Wait, what do you mean the next Sonic game is going through development hell? Yep, the Saturn infamously did not have a mainline Sonic game on it, giving people who only cared about Sonic no reason to buy. All they had were spin-offs. Sonic Jam was just a compilation of the Genesis game, so that's out. Sonic 3D Blast was also on the Sega Genesis, so yay. And the only original Sonic game was Sonic R, which is considered mediocre. Not good. The Saturn was a failure, especially in America. It did slightly better in Japan, but it came in last place compared to the PlayStation and N64. The Saturn does have a cult following nowadays, as it's seen as a console of great 2D games, and some games that had both a Saturn and PlayStation version have people generally say the Saturn version's better. So now Sega's in a pickle. Originally, they only had to compete with Nintendo, but now Sony's coming in and is making bank. What do? Well, they had one last chance to redeem themselves. Next-gen consoles were coming out, and Sega released the Dreamcast before the others came out in hopes it would give it an edge. Plus, the Dreamcast had real Sonic games on it, so hopefully it would do much better this time. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. While the Dreamcast has its fans and has some great games on it, it ended up being even more of a failure than the Saturn. And once the PS2 came out, that was it. Dreamcast was done for. In 2001, Sega announced they would no longer be making consoles. They would just purely be game developers. And this even included releasing games on Nintendo consoles. Those they used to mock in their commercials and were able to give a run for their money were now the ones who they had to come crawling to and being like, we'll make games for you. Truly a sad tale of a once mighty titan. Okay, now that we've talked about this guy's victims, I think it's time we give a proper introduction to the one who dethroned Nintendo. This is the Sony PlayStation, released in 1994 in Japan and 95 in North America. The PlayStation has its roots in Nintendo, believe it or not. You see, Nintendo had wanted to make a CD add-on for the SNES, and had contacted Sony to see if they could make one. But there was a falling out, and Sony decided, fine, we'll make our own then. And thus the PlayStation was born. And to say it take off would be an understatement. The PlayStation made bank. It completely dethroned Nintendo's dominance in the market, selling 3 times as many consoles as the N64. So, why did the PlayStation take off? Well, for a few reasons. One, its controller didn't look like it was made for cephalopods. But more importantly, it was cheaper than its rivals, and it had far more games. You see, because the PlayStation used CDs, it was very easy to program for, and they didn't have to worry about space as much as they would on a cartridge. So, because of that, a lot of companies that had previously only worked for Nintendo jumped ship to PlayStation, and because of that, many of the hottest games of the late 90s were exclusive to the system, making it must-have. So yeah, Sony had a hit console, and they only went up from there. In the year 2000, the PlayStation 2 came out, and to say it was even more successful would be an understatement. To this day, the PS2 is the highest-selling console of all time. Not only did it have the same advantage as before, being the console everyone wanted to make games for, but you could play your PS1 games on it, and more importantly, it could play DVDs. And because it was cheaper than most DVD players, it led people to buy it as a DVD player first before deciding to buy games for it. In 2004, PlayStation released the PS Portable as a competitor to the DS. It was touted as being a console just as powerful as a home system, and you could even use it to browse the internet. Sadly though, the DS was just more popular than it since it was more appealing to everyone and not just gamers. PSP still did pretty good, just not as good as the DS. The PS2 absolutely dominated its competitors, so when the next-gen hardware became available, Sony gobbled it right up and made the sure-to-be-a-hit PS3. Now in HD, it could play PS2 games, and it can still play DVDs. So this thing would be a surefire moneymaker. Wait, something's wrong. Why aren't we on top anymore? Yep, the PS3 not only didn't sell as well as the PS2, but it even sold less than the PS1, and for once, Sony was not on top. And in America, it was in third place. What happened? Well, there's a few things. For one, the launch and early marketing was horrible. Its launch titles were considered mediocre at best, and because Sony figured the system would sell itself because, PlayStation, they spent their advertising budget on weird, confusing ads that had little to do with the console. I have my own personal theory too as to why it was underwhelming in sales, and that's because it didn't really have a hook. You see, the Wii was the family console, while the 360 was the console seen as the real gamer console. This left the PS3 without a niche, and really the only people buying it were brand loyalists. Now, technically, it did sell more than the 360 overall, since, as we'll explain later, the Xbox doesn't do so well in Japan. But it was a very close race, and Sony almost lost. And like I said, it did lose in America. When the next gen started, Sony released the PS4, and yep, they are back on top. PS4 is only behind the PS2 in terms of the system sales, and just like the PS2, it trounced its competitors. So Sony is back on top, nothing can go wrong, and then they made the PS Vita sequel to the PHP, which is a failure, because of tough competition from the 3DS and smartphones. Yep. And then the PS5 launched, with barely any notable games on it, and it had overheating problems, and then the Switch proved to be making bank, so now Sony's in second place again. But, hey, it appears Sony works best in even numbers, so maybe the PS6 will be on top again. I guess odd numbers just aren't for them or something. So, after video games started to become really popular in the late 90s, old Billy became worried that games were going to become more popular than computers. Nowadays, we know that's nonsense, since computers are just as popular as game consoles. But remember, this was a legitimate fear in the late 90s because, 90s internet. So in order to not be killed off in this new game world, Microsoft made the Xbox, released in 2001. The Xbox became a hit with hardcore gamers due to the fact that, like the Genesis in the 90s, the Xbox gained a reputation as the console for the cool kids. The GameCube was a little baby game, little babies, and the PS2, that was too mainstream. The Xbox was for serious gamers. They were cool and gritty and, yeah, gamers! The Xbox sold like hotcakes in America, surpassing the GameCube, but unfortunately it came nowhere near the PS2. Because it's the PS2. But one thing to note, and something I think people often forget, is that the GameCube's loss wasn't actually a humiliating defeat. Look at these sales figures. The Xbox only sold a few million more than the GameCube, so it was pretty close overall. But how is that possible? The Xbox is super popular. Shouldn't the number be way higher? Well, you see, the box was a failure in Japan. Since this console was both made in America and clearly made for an American audience in mind, and so are most of the games, it meant it had a very difficult time making it to Japan, so it was a flop there. So yeah, the Xbox, definitely a success, but not as much as you might think. But beating Nintendo on your first try, that's definitely something to be proud of. In 2005, they made the Xbox 360, and oh boy, what a glow-up. This console was even more popular, selling 3 times as much as its predecessor, and like I said earlier, it sold more than the PS3 in America, though once again, not very popular in Japan, so PS3 ultimately went out globally. But it was a pretty close victory. One notable thing about the 360 was that in order to compete with the Wii, they released the Kinect, which was a motion control device. Except instead of a motion controller, you used your body as the controller. People did not like the Kinect, with the biggest complaints being that it wouldn't register movements, and you look like an idiot while playing. So yeah, Xbox is now one of the biggest names in gaming. What could go wrong? The next console is the Xbox One. Yeah, One. That is still one of the worst names for a product ever. Oh, what should the next one be called? I know, One! But it's not the first. Shut up! You're fired! Anyways, this console had a rough launch, as before it was released, it genuinely felt like Microsoft was going out of its way to make it as unappealing as possible. First off, they claimed the console would need a Kinect to work, which, as we established, gamers did not like the Kinect, so not very good. Oh, and the fact that they were weirdly focusing on everything about it, besides it as a video game console. Basically being like, you can watch TV and browse the internet and watch movies on it. But they basically never talked about it, but they basically never talked about the thing as a gaming console. And worst off, it was said there would be DRM that made it so that not only would you always need to be online to play, but you couldn't share games, even with discs. So not a good launch, but eventually caught up, and although it didn't come near the PS4, it sold a heck of a lot better than the Wii U. Currently, Xbox has the Series X, because naming conventions are for suckers. First you do angles, but then you name it's one, and now it's Series. Alright. Currently it's in 3rd place, and it has a while to go before it comes up to its competitors. So, the Xbox has never been on top, but hey, they're still going strong. Mostly because, well, like I said, this is really an American thing. It doesn't travel well, especially in Japan, so it's unlikely Xbox will ever be on top. Well, that's all, folks. I know there's a lot more consoles out there, but I don't care enough to talk about them, or they just don't have enough history. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and game on!